Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Nick Berbulis. I'm the editor of Educational Theory. I'm here today with Eirik Risberg. He goes by Julius, so I'll call him Julius in the interview. He published a paper in the journal called Fostering Empathy in Global Citizenship Education. And I'm really looking forward to a conversation with him about his article. Welcome, Julius.
And thank you very much, Nick. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So I think one of the major contributions of your paper is you do a deep dive into this concept of empathy and what it means or how it should be understood, how it differs from other related concepts like sympathy or compassion. So let's start with that point. How do you understand the educational significance of empathy, and how do you think are some of the ways in which it's often misunderstood or mischaracterized?
Yes, so empathy is frequently invoked as a very important concept in education, particularly in global citizenship education, which is the concept, the context where I've been exploring it. It's frequently invoked as a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling, and it's generally taken to be really important. But I think that if you look at the literature and philosophy and psychology over the past 2 or 3 decades, it's become more contested as a concept, the way it plays in moral philosophy in particular. So my motivation for exploring this was really the discrepancy between the way it's discussed in philosophy and psychology and the lack of conceptualization in education, which I found to be really puzzling and in need of clarification.
So one of the points that you make in this discussion is that while we often characterize empathy as a certain kind of feeling or emotion, it actually has and must have cognitive content. Can you say more about that cognitive component of empathy and why, again, especially in educational context, it's important?
Yes, well, so empathy is frequently reduced to this affective component, which is an important part of the concept, obviously, the notion that we ought to feel how the target, so to speak, feels, to be able to understand his or her feelings. Well, I think that's just one part of the concept, an important part, as I said, but let's not forget the cognitive component, which is that we ought to be able to understand his or her points of view, from her beliefs, how the situation looks from his or her perspective, which I think has more value in education rather than just feeling the emotion of the other.
Yeah, so let's go ahead.
No, sorry, I was...
Okay, well, let's say more about this issue of perspective taking, because that's really at the heart of the way in which you're conceptualizing empathy here. Let's explore more that idea of perspective taking. And you make an interesting distinction between what I would do in that situation versus what that person would do or perceive in that situation. That's an interesting distinction right there.
Yes, it's a tricky concept, empathy, which has been developed in numerous ways. One of the more recent distinctions is this distinction between taking the other's perspective. What does that mean? Does it mean that I myself project myself into that person's situation and imagine how things look from his or her point of view, adopting his or her values, or does it mean that I imagine being myself in that particular situation, acting, seeing it from my own perspective, my own values, which is often just overlooked in the literature because it makes a huge distinction whether you see things through your own eyes or through somebody else's eyes.
Yeah, so we live in a time, I would say, especially sort of post Levinas or Derrida or other theorists, where there's a certain skepticism about the possibility of perspective taking from the standpoint of another. Can you say more about that particular criticism and how you respond to it?
Yes, well, one of the authors that I rely on in this paper, Peter Goldie, deliberately opts for a modest perspective taking, namely the idea that that we should rest content with adopting the perspective or just imagining ourselves into the situation of someone else, but retaining our own values and beliefs, not trying to go all the way, creeping into someone else's head, so to speak, and seeing how things look from their point of view, adopting their values. And I think that's sensible. But the argument he makes is that this would be to usurp the first person point of view. I am, however, really interested in this question, which is something I'd like to pursue in the future, this connection between agency and empathy, which is, of course, as you say, important in the phenomenological tradition and the hermeneutical tradition as well. So how far can we go in imagining the other's perspective?
So let's now situate this, as you said earlier, in the context of global citizenship education. That's really in a sense, the overarching concern or focus of the paper. Why is empathy, I think it's maybe somewhat obvious from what you've already said, but why is empathy important in the way you're describing it in the context of global citizenship education?
Well, I think it allows us an epistemic entry into other people's positions, other people's situations, without going all the way, as some would like to go. I think a lot of people would perhaps prefer to see empathy as somewhat more invasive, in the sense that it could allow you to really feel how the other feels. But I think that we should at least salvage the idea that we can see other people's point of view from their perspective. So it's an epistemic concept. I would like to develop this idea further, because it's been touted as a really important moral concept as well. But so in this paper, I guess I rest content with describing it as an epistemic concept.
So let's tie it into this idea of education itself. What is it that's educational about this process of perspective taking, or you sometimes say complex perspective taking? What's educational about that process?
Well, I think my most recent paper is actually, apart from this one, is a paper exploring the idea of Bildung, the German concept of education, and global citizenship, in which I think that empathy may play an important role in that part of concept that ties in neatly with the idea of Bildung as something that is not only about understanding other people, but understanding oneself and developing one's own capacities.
Yeah, let's take a step forward from that point. One of my colleagues here, who deals with issues of multicultural education, says that you might think on the surface that the reason for multicultural education is in order to understand and appreciate other cultures. And of course, that's part of the purpose. But he said the deeper purpose of multicultural education is that by understanding or experiencing or developing an appreciation for these other cultures, one views one's own culture in a different way. For one thing, you don't see it any longer as the only or the natural or the normal one. You realize that it's only one perspective among many. Maybe I'm starting to answer your question for you, but in what way is there a parallel here? But through this perspective taking of others, we also learn to discover something about ourselves, even the limitations, perhaps, of our own worldview.
Yes, and I think one can add to that, because I absolutely agree to what you just said, is that this is a point that Justin Dahms has been making, the idea that taking the other person's perspective makes that person's values salient for me. So it opens up a door to really understand this as valuable from another person's perspective. So in that sense, it expands our notion of human values in general.
So what are some ways in which one can actually do this in pedagogical contexts? What are some approaches through which one can foster the kind of empathy that one wants to pursue in, let's say, a classroom for young students or for older students? I mean, maybe there's some developmental questions there as well, but how does one actually do this?
Yes, I guess that's a tricky question, but I've been reading a really interesting book by Thomas Kohut on history and empathy. And one of the really interesting features that he addresses is how history in particular, look very different from our perspective than it did for the people who were actually living that time. Say, for instance, during the Second World War, in which the idea of appeasing Hitler may seem really weird to us now with hindsight, but at the time it was widely agreed upon as a good idea. Now that can, if you can really bring students to see the perspective or how things looked at that time, you've gained a valuable historical insight, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting observation, because one might normally go more towards anthropological or sociological accounts of other cultures or other traditions. People wouldn't normally go to history as a way of framing these kinds of questions. What about the role of literature in this process?
Yes, I'm an avid reader myself, and I believe in the power of literature. I think that one should be wary, though, as I emphasize in my paper, to hone in on the emotional side of empathy, because too often I think literature has just been used to produce some kind of emotion rather than reflection on events in history, for instance. So
Yes.
while this is important to be able to capture some of the emotional trauma, say, again, around the Second World War, it might obscure some of the cognitive insights if one goes all the way down that line.
I understand. Julius, thank you so much for your time. I want to encourage people to read your paper. It's a really interesting and I think revealing analysis of a word that we use a lot, often without critical reflection. And I think your paper really helps us to think about empathy in much deeper and more complex ways. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It's been a great pleasure to be here.